Hello everyone, this is Dr. Skinner. Let's get ready to do chapter 10, designing forms and reports. What are we going to be looking at today in today's class? The learning objectives, here we see on the screen. Explain the process of designing forms and reports and the deliverables for their creation. What's a form? What's a report? What's the difference between the two? What are the guidelines that we need to follow when we come to formatting forms and reports? What's our use of color? When does color help us? When does color not help us? How do we format? How do we format our text, our tables, our lists? What's this concept of usability? What are the factors that influence usability? And then let's discuss some of the guidelines for the design of forms for an internet-based system. So today it's all about presentation of data, all right? So we're contextualizing our data that we've been looking at already. We're thinking about, okay, how do we share that data in the context of forms and reports, and so on and so forth. So let's begin. Okay, so here we are, we're still in the design phase of the SDLC. We've looked at databases, so now we're looking at forms and reports, and then in the next few classes we'll move on to dialogues and interfaces, and then distributed internet systems, and then 2 classes on implementation and maintenance, respectively. Okay, so the thing to remember when we are designing our forms and reports, okay, so here we see it on the screen. Each input form or report corresponds to a data flow entering a data flow diagram process. Okay, so let's think back to our burgers data flow diagram, Hoosier's Burgers. Remember when we had data flow entering a process, this is what an input form or report is all about. So an input form, remember, is where we're putting data into our environment. An output form is a report corresponds to a data flow produced by a DFD process. So you think about the arrow coming in for an input form, the arrow going out for an output form or report. Okay. What else do we see? A form report data consists of data elements within the data flow diagram, data stores, and on the entity relationship diagram for the application. So the actual data itself is the data stored within our DFD data stores on our data flow diagrams and on the ER diagram from the application perspective as well. Okay. And that last point to note, that during this design process that we're going to be looking at today's class, all the diagrams should be updated as designs evolve. So if I am making changes as I think about the needs of my forms and reports for either or both of my data flow diagrams or my entity relationship diagrams, it's quite possible that I'll have to go back to those steps that I was looking at beforehand, make changes, and then re-evolve again. So we take nothing for granted. So what do we mean by a form? We talk about forms. What do we mean by a form? Okay, it helps if I press the right button. There we go. A form, a business document that contains some predefined data and may include areas where additional data are to be filled in. I will draw your attention to that second line. An instance of a form is typically based on one database record. So what do I mean by that? So I may have forms, a collection of forms. Each individual instance of a form, so let's say I complete a form or a report is passed to me, each individual one basically aligns or is based on a single database record. Okay, so it could be for a specific customer, it could be for a specific order. It'll correlate with a single record in our database. Okay, and typically it won't be in that format that we're used to seeing in our database tables. It won't be the simple row column format. As you can see here, an example on the screen, this registration information form is not in rows and columns. It is just in the way that it is. Okay, so we have the examples of product order forms, employment applications, class registration forms, and so on and so forth. And typically in our forms, you will have some predefined data, but there will be space that you will be expected to provide yourself. So you're going to be entering in new data that will need to be filled in. How does a form differentiate to a report? Well, Let me just get my screen going. There we go. A report, what does it say? A business document that contains only predefined data. Okay, so this is a passive document. We're only looking, viewing, and taking on board the data that is being presented to us. Okay, so we're not expected with reports to complete missing data. All right, we're not looking to enter in our own data. We're looking at historical facts. All right, so this is a passive document. And what else is it? It typically contains data from many unrelated records. So it's a synthesis, right? It's a concatenation of different data from different sources we bring together to visualize in the context of each other so that we can get a summary understanding about what is going on. And so you have some examples here: invoices, weekly sales summary. So we're seeing a lot of data from a lot of different records. Okay. So how many types of reports are we usually going to be seeing or interested in the context of our class? Well, here we have 5 types of reports that we are interested in. Let's have a look at them in turn. So scheduled reports, these reports produced at predefined intervals, daily, weekly, or monthly, to support the routine informational needs of an organization. So these are the reports that you can expect to get as and when you are going to have these reports being generated. So these are the ones that happen all the time. Whoops-a-daisy. Let me just change this back. My system is going bonkers. All right, what's going on here? There we go. So what else we have? Key indicator reports. These are the critical information reports. These are the reports that provide a summary of critical information on a recurring basis. So for instance, if I'm the CEO of an organization, I'm going to have these key indicator reports, these key performance indicators that are telling me how the whole organization is doing, what areas doing better than others. I'll be able to compare different time zones, different dates, different organizational areas, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so key indicator reports, these critical information. Exception reports are those reports that highlight data that are out of the normal operating range. So this can be either a positive or a negative thing, remember. So if I have a report where we're outside of our normal performance range, then maybe this will be the context for an exception report to be generated. A drill down report, a report that provides details between the summary values on a key indicator or an exception report. So if I am getting a key indicator report or an exception report, and I want to get some more information as to the causes of why something's performing very well or not so well, a drill down report is the context that allows me to do that. And then our ad hoc report, this unplanned information request in which information is gathered to support a non-routine decision. So if somebody, a senior manager, comes along and says, oh, I need this report for this specific context as a one-off, this is what an example of an ad hoc report might look like. So this all raises the questions in turn. So how do we go about designing forms and reports so they are fit for purpose? And essentially, there is a 3-step process that we need to follow that kind of talks around the need to collect the requirements from our user community, prototype some forms or reports, and then get our users to review and sign off. At the heart of all of this is the user needs, what we call this user-centered design. This design approach that involves an understanding of our target audience, their tasks and goals, information needs, experience levels, and so on and so forth. So we are going to be talking to them. As systems analysts, we've already been talking and interacting with our community already, haven't we? We think about our database needs and entity relationship diagrams and systems analysis and all the rest of that stuff. So hopefully we've already acknowledged as well from our project management context the need for communication. Communication is key to success for systems analysis. So step 1, collect initial requirements during requirements determination. And here we have table 10.2, some of the key questions to ask when we are trying to design these forms and reports. Who's going to use it? What's the purpose? When is it going to be needed and used? Where does it need to be delivered and used to? How many people are going to use or view the form, and so on and so forth? So we're going to get all this information back. We're going to get a big pile of info back, and this is going to inform our next step, which is prototyping. Okay, so I'm going to draw up some prototype screens that I'm going to offer to my user community as a result of going through this process, and they are essentially going to sign off. So we have different types of prototyping that we might want to consider. So we have this paper prototyping. You know, you might literally, if you're printing out these forms and people are filling them by hand, that might be appropriate. We're probably going to come up with initial prototypes, probably a few of them actually, in my experience. And then we'll pass that on to our user community. They'll have a look at it and sign off over one probably over the other, or they might rank them. You may have used an old tool. You might have used a coding sheets, or maybe you're using Visual Basic or other computer-aided graphical user interface forms or otherwise. So here we can see an example of a coding sheet where we're trying to lay out our data, so in such a way that the users can have a clear understanding about what needs to be seen. From a VB perspective, this is what something might look like from a prototyping design perspective. So you can see more of a graphical user interface context, and people can sign off on the buttons. We also have this thing called wireframes. What's this wireframes? What does it say on the left-hand side? This simple design to show the placement of information elements on a screen and the space needed for each element. So it kind of breaks this down and contextualizes each element of data and how that data is going to be transformed to information on the screen, and how it interacts with the space it is in and with all the other information and data on the screen as well. And this is particularly useful so you can develop a series of screens and for the user community to sign off on the look and feel of the design. So we kind of go through this prototyping process as the second step, and then we go back to our users and we say to the users, okay, we've done these prototypes based on your inputs, and we want you to sign off or require or advise any changes that are needed. If you want changes, then this construction, evaluation, refinement cycle is going to keep on going, and we'll go through this iterative circle as many times as is needed, but hopefully not too many. And then at the end of it all, once we've got final sign-off, then we will be able to proceed with actually creating the recommendations and guidelines for creating the form itself. Okay, so as a result of doing all this, okay, we're going to come up with our deliverables on our forms and reports, which is going to be the design specs for them. You've got to remember that as we move through phase to phase of each of the phases in the SDLC, each activity that we do produces a deliverable that is used later on. So in the case of designing forms and reports, the design specs, the design specifications are the major deliverable and input to the system implementation phase that we are going to be following on later on. So what is going to be involved? We're going to have in our design specifications, we're going to have a narrative overview, a sample design, and our testing and usability assessment. So our narrative overview explains why the form report exists, how it's going to be used, some of the general information, the assumptions that we've used to shape the design, and then our sample design, what it's actually going to look like, and then there's testing and usability assessment, i.e., well, let's talk about testing and usability in a little while. Usability is very, very important. Okay, so when we're formatting our forms and reports, here we go to the design. Think about this from the design perspective. We have four major areas. We have titles, information, layout, and ease of navigation. Okay, let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So our titles, it's got to be meaningful. A lot of this is common sense, isn't it? I kind of look at this, and each time I teach it, I always kind of reflect that it's common sense. You don't want to have a title that is not going to be clear and easy to understand for everybody using the form or report, right? It's got to be simple, it's got to be useful, it's got to be relevant, it's got to be meaningful. So clear and specific titles describing content and use of form report, revision date or code to distinguish a form report from prior versions. Of course, forms and reports are going to change over time, and their needs are going to change as the information system itself changes. The current date, when the form report was generated, and the valid date, i.e. which the date or time the data in the form report are accurate. So meaningful titles, meaningful information. All the information that we're displaying, that's got to be relevant as well, okay? And the information should be provided in a manner that is usable without modification. You don't want to have to change the information in there because it's not clear or concise to your needs. The layout's got to be balanced. It's got to kind of be appealing visually, appealing on the eye. So it should be balanced on the screen or page, margins, spacing, and so on and so forth, labeling. We'll look at all that in a few slides' time. And then how to move through different pages if that is appropriate for your form report and it's online. So where are you? How do you move forward? How do you move backward? Can you move forward? Can you move backward? So, and when you're on the last page as well. Let's look at an example of a poorly designed form, okay? So here we have a poorly designed form. Pretty vague title, customer information. Well, what does that mean? What sort of information? We're talking about which customer? It's not clear to me. Okay, information is packed very, very tightly, isn't it? It's not easy to read. There's no navigation backwards and forwards. There's no summary. The columns are not clear. It's just mixed up. It's not a very good form at all. If I kind of look at this and I compare it with this one, whoa, now you're talking, right? So we've got a nice balanced columns. We've got all sorts of things going on. It's very clear, nice clear title. We have summaries. We are able to move forwards and backwards. We know when we're going to exit, clear navigation, what page we're on, and so on and so forth. That's very good. What else can we talk about apart from this layout? What about highlighting data? Okay, highlighting. Now, we kind of think about when we highlight, we go crazy, right? I mean, the more we highlight, the more things are going to stand out, pop out, and going to be more clearly. And that's not actually the case. So we've got to do it in context, everything in moderation, right? So highlighting, sparingly used, consistently used, and relative to importance. If you highlight everything, then everything is of the same importance, right? So contextualize it, think about it, okay? If you have an error, that might be something to highlight. If there are potential problems or warnings, let's highlight it. And also the potential to highlight keywords, commands, high priority stuff, and so on and so forth. So what do we mean by highlighting? Well, what are the different ways we can highlight? And here we have on the screen many different examples. So you can have uppercase, bold, italics, underlining, boxing. You put a box around it, different size and different color differences. Blinking. When I first created this slide back in the day, blinking used to blink on the screen, but it stopped doing that. What else we have? Intensity, reverse video, audio, blah, 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 blah. So these are all different examples of highlighting. Let's look at example. Oh, there we go. It did blink. Look, there you go. I thought it was all over. Right. Example of highlighting. So Pine Valley Furniture at the top there, font size, intensity, current balance, all capital letters, boxing around all the dates of the purchases and payments and so on and so forth, and balance. We have different intensities, we have bold data, and so on and so forth. So this is all helping us to better represent and for our user community to understand the information that we are being presented. Here we also have discussion about color. Color, the benefits and problems from using color. Do you want color everywhere, or do you only want to use color in certain situations? Well, as you can see here, there are both benefits and challenges as a result of using color. So color soothes the eye. It's a bit of an uninteresting display if it's all a little bit boring. Of course, it's never been boring, but if it was a little bit boring, maybe it gives you a little accent or something that really makes something stand out, draws attention to warnings and so on and so forth. But people who are colorblind, doesn't really work. What you see on the screen, is that going to be replicated if you print it out? No, different displays may show color in different ways, and so on and so forth. So there are benefits, but then again, there are challenges. What about displaying text? Well, when we come to displaying text, there are some guidelines that we should follow. So let's see what they say. It's display text in mixed uppercase and lowercase and use conventional punctuation. Use double spacing if space permits. If not, place a blank line between paragraphs. Okay, this is all good sense. Justification. Left justified text and leave a ragged right margin. Okay, so everything to the left and don't do a right justified text so it's all the same. Jagged right margin, it makes it easier to read. Hyphenation, do not hyphenate words between lines. Okay, so if you're going to hyphenate a word, make sure it's not at the end of one line and the beginning of the next. And abbreviations. I get really frustrated by abbreviations. Do you remember all those times that you've kind of read something and people have been using abbreviations left, right, and center, and you have no idea what it's all about, right? WTF. I'm not allowed to say that, but hey. Use abbreviations and acronyms only when they are widely understood by users and are significantly shorter than the full text. Let's look at a bad example of displaying text. All right, yeah, that's not a very good screen, right? There's lots of violations of what we should be doing, right? The vague title, it's all one text fixed and uppercase, there's single spacing, there's no blanks, yada, 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 yada. If I got that, I would get as far as about the intent of this screen is to retrieve custom, and then I'll give up, okay? A better example is this, okay? So we have a clear title, we have mixed case text size, we have less justification, we have spacing between sections, and so on and so forth. Our field descriptions are a ragged right line. It's all good. It's all good. So that's for text. What about guidelines for displaying tables and lists? Okay, so we have similar recommendations as well, similar guidelines. So again, make sure your labels make sense. They have a meaning, they have value. So use meaningful labels, okay? Separate your labels from other information by using highlighting, okay? Format your columns, your rows, and your text. Let's look at some of these in a little bit more detail. So sort in a meaningful order, ascending or descending or alphabetic. Doesn't matter what it is, as long as it makes sense and it's meaningful to the user community. Place a blank line between every 5 rows in long columns. That's a good idea. One I don't actually do very often, but I'm going to from now on in. Similar information displayed in multiple columns should be sorted vertically, i.e. read from top to bottom, not left to right. Kind of makes sense. Columns should have at least 2 spaces between them. Allow white space on printed reports for users to write notes. I can tell you now, as a professor, that is so important. Use a single typeface, except for emphasis. Use the same family typefaces within and across displays and reports. So what's the word I'm looking for? Just carry on using the same words, the same typefaces all the time. Consistent, there we go, be consistent. And don't go and please use fancy fonts that no one can use, and don't do Comic Sans font. I get so annoyed by that. I got a certificate from the university when I completed my PhD for being a general superstar, and they wrote it all in Comic Sans font, and it looks ridiculous. And it was just like, oh man, really? They should have done it in a different font. What else? Format numeric, textual, and alphanumeric data. We have some rules that we have to follow. So we right justify numeric data and align columns by decimal points or other delimiter. We left justify textual data, okay, using 30 to 40 characters per line. And then long sequences of alphanumeric data, we should break into small groups of 3 to 4 characters each. Let's look at a bad version of this. Yeah, no labels, single column for all types of data, numeric data are left justified. What did we just say? Numeric data should be right justified. And let's look at this one. So now the numeric data are right justified. We've got clear separate column labels and so on and so forth. Again, this is all just common sense. You can understand what we're saying, and it makes sense when you are reading it. Right, what am I doing here? Okay. Right, let's think about also the differences between our tables and our graphs. Okay, so let's look at tables and graphs. Tables, difference between a table and a graph. Tables used for reading individual data values. Graphs, it's a bit like forms and reports, right? So forms you use it for one thing, reports are for looking at a summary historical data, right? So tables used for reading individual data values. Graphs, we're providing a summary of multiple data values, looking at differences over time, comparing variables and points, looking at used for forecasting. If I've got lots of information, maybe this is the way I want to quickly and make a determination, understanding about what's going on. So if I look here at this table, this is a good example from the book. So we have meaningful labels in all columns and rows. Alphabetic text is left justified. We've got our meaningful title. We put a box around it to improve the appearances. Superscript characters, i.e. these things down the bottom, can be used to alert reader of more detailed information. I use superscript all the time in all of my papers that I send and get published. It's very, very important if you want to include information that's not really relevant 100% to the message you're giving in the main part of the paper, but you can't leave it out. That's when I use superscript. My columns are sorted in meaningful order. My sequence of alphanumeric data are broken up. I've justified all my data, my numeric data, and I've tried to get everything onto a single page. All right, it helps when I'm looking and comparing data. If I then look at graphs, here we have a line graph and a bar graph, and again, you can very quickly determine, create or generate understanding about what's going on as a result of looking at the graph. So line graph, you can see Hawthorne straight away is the best performance salesperson, and so on and so forth. What about paper and electronic reports? That conversation, that discussion. Well, just remember, some printers don't allow for you to neatly print off screen displays, and color may be an issue. Maybe the resolution of your printer and or your information system is not going to be good enough. Your display is not going to be adequately replicated when you transform from a paper to an electronic report. But again, you will follow this prototyping process to evaluate the most appropriate report displays. Now, earlier on, we talked about, and I mentioned this importance of this thing called usability. Let's quickly discuss what we mean by usability. And usability is this overall evaluation of how a system performs in supporting a particular user for a particular task. Okay. And it is, as you can see, an objective of designing forms, reports, and all human and computer interactions. We want high levels of usability. Okay, so what do we mean by usability? Well, we're talking about speed, accuracy, and satisfaction. So these are the factors to consider when we are designing our forms and reports. Speed. Can we complete a task necessarily efficiently? Accuracy, does the system provide us with what we are expecting it to provide us? And satisfaction, do we actually like using the system? So the objective for designing is usability. Okay, what are the considerations for usability? Well, we're thinking about our user, we're thinking about our task, our system, and our environment. So these are the factors that influence the usability of a design. So we think about our user community. What's their experience, their skills, their motivation, the education, their personality? Now, obviously, if you've got a huge user community of 400 people who are going to be using your system or larger, then you can only do so much. But if you're a small boutique, bespoke organization, and maybe there's 10 or 20 users who are using your information system, maybe you can think about more appropriately their experience, what skills, their levels of education, their type of personality, and so on and so forth. Task. What's the time pressure that people are under when they're using your system? What's the impact if things go wrong and they make a mistake? How long are they going to be working on the system at any one time? What's the nature of the platform that is being used in this context? And what are the environments? What are the ongoing environment in which this system is being used? What's that context, and how does that inform our design? The way we measure success when it comes to usability is in 5 factors. And this is consistency, efficiency, ease, format, and flexibility. Let's look at these in turn in a little bit more detail. Okay, so consistency. Are we being consistent in our use of terminology, abbreviations, formatting, titles, and so on and so forth? All right, we should be consistent at all times and in all places. Efficiency. When we're doing our formatting, do we have an understanding of the task being performed and the intended user? Okay, everything's got to be designed around their needs for efficient navigation and data entry. Okay, so data should be avoided where possible, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we've got to make sure that when we do, we are as efficient as we possibly can. Ease, okay? Ease. Output should be self-explanatory and not require users to remember information from prior outputs to complete tasks. Labels should be extensively used and all scales and units of measures should be clearly indicated. Format. Information format should be consistent between entry and display, and so on and so forth. And flexibility. Information should be viewed and retrieved in a manner most convenient for the user. For example, users should be given options for the sequence in which to enter view data, and so on and so forth. You want to give them the ability to design, as much as they're allowed to, their own ways of inputting and interacting with the information. Okay, and then we have our metrics. How do we measure usability? Well, we measure it using these 5 metrics: learnability, efficiency, error rate, memorability, and satisfaction and aesthetics. And you can do a poll, you can do a survey, and you can do like Likert scales on scale of 1 to 10 and so on and so forth. How difficult is it for a user to perform a task? How quickly can users perform tasks? How many errors might a user encounter? And so on and so forth. So again, this is just a way, once you've done it, this is to get feedback on what you've done. Hopefully you're going to get high scores because you've got the user community involved from the very earliest days. So hopefully there's not going to be too many challenges in this space. The other thing we got to appreciate is that humans are involved. Yeah, and when humans are involved, people do things wrong and we take shortcuts. And because we're humans, we do make mistakes. Okay, and this page, I just want to talk about it. Some of the common errors we kind of see when designing the layout of web pages. All right, so look at these errors: non-standard use of graphical user interface widgets, anything like advertising, and so on and so forth, outdated information, fixed formats text, yada yada yada. Please look at all of this and look at the recommendations, and then let's see that we don't include this when we're doing our web page layout. Okay, so that's the first class in this space on designing forms and reports. Think of the things we've got to talk about. So what did we look at? We looked at the process designing forms and reports, deliverables for their creation. We talked about some of the general guidelines for formatting forms and reports. We talked about color and formatting texts and tables and lists. We talked about this concept of usability, and then this page, some of the common errors. Let's go to our assignment. So this is for our chapter 10 assignment. Okay, question 1. Describe the prototyping process of designing forms and reports. What deliverables are produced? Are these deliverables the same for all types of system projects? Why or why not? So as a group, I want you to have a think about and come up with some good answers for these 3 questions. What deliverables are produced as a result of prototyping, the prototyping process of designing forms and reports? Are they always going to be the same? If so, why? If not, why not? And then number 2, what initial questions must be answered for an analyst to build an initial prototype of a system output? So in answering this question, have a think about an example of a system you may have already built in a previous, or talked about in a previous assignment, and then talk about it in that context. So tell me about the information, remind me what the information system is all about and the context, for what type of organization, what's its role, and then think about these questions that must be given by an analyst to a user community and must be answered so that the analyst can build up an initial prototype of a system output. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that class. I will be working on the next class and this will be uploaded as soon as I can get it to it. All right, thanks so much. Speak soon. Bye.